So the war on Gaza has been on government's agenda in recent weeks. So too are efforts to end fighting in places such as Ukraine, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and closer to our borders in Mozambique. Let's talk more about South Africa's presence in global mediation efforts now. Bring in Wits University's Professor Gilbert Kgadiagala. Professor, very good evening to you. Good to have your time on News at Prime. I think a good place to begin is with taking a holistic view at South Africa's position and its ability to basically act as a mediator in conflicts, both on the continent and further afield?
I think before the Gaza war, South Africa had taken a very active role in global mediation efforts, particularly the war in Ukraine, but also in Africa through the leadership of SADC in ending the war in northern Mozambique. And then across the Great Lakes region, South Africa also has been very persistent in trying to get the conflict in the eastern DRC to come to an end. And so it's been very instrumental in the new program that is going to send SADC military force in that part of the eastern DRC, where the war between the rebels and the government has been going on for quite a while. So that position is there. And then, of course, when it came to the war between Israel and Gaza, South Africa also took a very clear role in leading efforts to make sure that, in fact, there is a ceasefire in that war.
And I want to talk just about the two perhaps more prominent wars in the world right now that are getting at least the most media coverage, that being at the moment the bombardment of Gaza and what Israel has said is a war on Hamas. We know thousands of civilians have been killed in the process. There's also been, in the last, almost 2 years now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those who've criticized Pretoria's condemnation of Israel's actions against the people of Gaza have said, well, why wasn't Pretoria as fervent in its condemnation of Putin and his army rolling into neighboring Ukraine? Does that compromise the country's stance or position as an honest broker for peace across the board?
You know, that criticism I've seen from many quarters, that South Africa needed a very consistent position in condemning aggression, whether it's aggression in Ukraine or aggression elsewhere. And that moral position is being compromised somewhat by causing up to Russia. But I think what happened during the Ukraine conflict is that South Africa has pretty much made up for the so-called compromising position by essentially leading the African Peace Initiative, which was supposed to mediate that conflict. So one can actually criticize the double standards, but double standards are very common in international relations. On Gaza, I think South Africa has had very good relations with Palestinian authorities for many years, and South Africa supports the cause against Israel. So there is really not much consistency there. It just depends on which wars you want to fight and what friends you want to please and which enemies you want to embarrass. So it's very consistent, a very double standard that occurs routinely in international relations.
And it's a double standard that is not unique to South Africa, because even the West has been called out for that very same double standard in dealing with Russia versus how it's propping up Israel in the war against Hamas, right?
Precisely. So when South Africa is criticized for not criticizing Russia, the South African government has, I think, the moral authority to condemn Western support for Israel aggression against the Palestinians. So again, I think all this balance out in the end. I think what we are trying to look for is what are the best and what are the most ideal solutions to ending these wars and these conflicts,
but
despite the
what
double
does that
standards.
mean then, Professor Kgadiagala, that very hypocrisy which we've all, it appears, have come to accept exists, in fact, from countries across the board? Because even Zelensky, who himself is opposed to the Russian invasion of his country, does not condemn the occupation of Palestinian territories by the Israelis. So for South Africa then, how does it take the goodwill that it's got, it appears even with Russia and Ukraine, for instance, how does it take that and use it effectively to broker peace?
I think what South Africa has done effectively is to say, in Palestine, we need a global solution. And the solution to that problem is very much part of our national psyche or international psyche. There are rules, there are clear frameworks within the UN about how to resolve that conflict. And those are stated very clearly in the two-state policy. There should be two states in that region, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. So that position has been very consistently applied, I think, across the board.
Okay.
And South Africa has raised that as a key issue in the solution to that problem. In Ukraine, I think what South Africa did is it didn't want to condemn Russia because it thought it was important to reach out to both sides. The condemnation of Russia would have removed the chances of South Africa's attempt to mediate between Ukraine and Russia. So ultimately, I think we can still get at the same solutions if these actors on the ground, if these actors in the wars actually are willing to end these wars.
Okay.
Because the templates even for ending the Ukraine-Russia conflict are there. I think this conflict had been negotiated, and that is why the African Peace Plan contains a number of provisions that are actually going to give us a roadmap towards the resolution of that conflict. What I'm saying, therefore, is that universally, South Africa condemns, the violation of human rights across the board, even though in some cases it may not want to alienate countries that it considers its allies, in the case of Russia and Ukraine. But it gives it the position to begin to stand up between the two countries and mediate between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And this is what they have been doing. And I understand they are still reaching out to both sides, even as the international attention has been distracted from that war.
Right. And let's end with issues closer to home, because as we know, currently, Mozambique has had that insurgency in its north for several years. There is a SADC force that was deployed there. At some point, I think 1 or 2 South African soldiers, in fact, were killed in active combat. You've got the DRC, which has gone through several periods of peril over the last 3 decades or so. There are those who then say countries like South Africa should focus less, perhaps, on what's happening in the West and elsewhere, and pour more of their energies into conflicts closer to home. Is that a fair critique? And are they putting enough effort and time into helping a country such as neighboring Mozambique to come out of the insurgency?
I think they have done enough in northern Mozambique. Since the Southern African force was deployed on the ground, there has been substantive improvement on the side of the civilians in Cabo Delgado. The attacks have declined considerably, and some people attribute that to the deployment of the SADC force, but also remember that there is a Rwanda force there on the ground. So the combination of these two actors has made a difference. But let me also say this. These actors, regional actors, also need international support. They need international attention. So we cannot look at northern Mozambique or the DRC in isolation from the global context, where we have to go, despite this being localized conflict, but South Africa has to mobilize its partners internally, regionally, but also internationally, so that they can bring resources to, especially pressures, towards ending this conflict.
Professor Gilbert Kgadiagala, always good to speak to you. Professor Kgadiagala is with Wits University here in Johannesburg. Thank you, sir.